Welcome, everybody. As you know, I am the head of ACT for Canada. I've been doing this for, about 9 years, I guess, and it gets harder and harder, but anyhow, we're all fighters and we're not going to give up. Our guest today is Elisabeth Sabaditsch-Wolff. I met Elisabeth, and I can't remember what year it was, but in Washington, D.C. at an ACT for America conference. And it was interesting because Elisabeth had come, and if I remember correctly, which is not always easy, she wasn't one of the featured speakers, but Brigitte had heard her story, and she said, you know what, you've got to hear about Elisabeth, and she gave her the podium. And so Elisabeth got up and told her story about what had happened to her in Austria, and how she's been charged and convicted. And it was such an overwhelming story, I just couldn't believe it. So anyhow, I went up and I introduced myself, you know how I love to network and everything, I love to have famous friends. And I just thought she was like so amazingly brave and courageous. So I followed her career ever since. We have done a lot of things together. I've flown to Austria to be with her. We've done the OSCE and in Warsaw and Poland, and been to several ACT for America conferences. Anyhow, Elisabeth is one of the real freedom fighters in this world today. And after going through 9 years, and I can't remember how many courts, but she'll tell you, the final court in March said that, you know what, it was over, she was guilty, there was no higher place to take it, end of story. And it was a terrible thing that happened because it was like the day before her mom died. So it was not a good time for Elisabeth. In any case, she kind of made the decision that Europe is basically finished, and I think we all realize that because, you know, we all read a lot. And so she is not a person to give up, and she figures, you know what, if I can't save Europe, I'm going to try and save North America. So Elisabeth is over here. She's come quite often, and she will be continuing to come to try and educate Canadians and Americans that the fight is here and it's getting worse. So with no further words, I would like to introduce my dear friend, my fighting warrior, Elisabeth Sabaditsch-Wolff.
Well, Valerie, crazy woman in a good sense, because, you know, every word that you said about me, minus the hate speech charge and the battle, I have to return to you, because you're doing the same thing, minus the court case, but, you know, you'll get there too. No. And then you can come to me and I'll give you all the advice that you need, okay?
Thank you.
But you're fighting in court anyway,
yes,
also.
We are.
Yeah, you and
Madeline.
Yes. So you know what that's like. It's not a lot of fun. It costs a lot of money, but it's so worth it. And before I tell you about the story, just a quick note that if you were to ask me, would I change anything I did or said? Not a single thing. I don't regret anything I did or anything I said in those 10 years that have passed. Because I still believe that what I said 10 years ago is the truth and nothing but the truth. And that's what got me convicted, and that's why the book, which I hope you will not only buy but also read, it's not meant for, it's not a coffee table book. So you really, you know, I would be honored if you read it. That's why the book is called The Truth Is No Defense. That's why it needed to be written after the 10 years. And the reason I finally got around to writing it this year was as Valerie already said, my mother passed away, so that freed up some time for me. And B, the court case was now finally over. People have been asking me for the past 10 years, well, you should write a book. When are you finally writing your book? We need to know more about you. Because a lot of what I talk about in the book, I don't really talk about when I'm speaking, because there's not enough time, there's no real reason. But the book explains or answers all the questions. Well, why the heck did she do this? Why didn't she continue reading her Danielle Steele novels that she loved so much? And that taught her the English language when she was 12 or 13. Believe me, it's something I would really like to do, but I don't have the time, and there's more important books to read and to educate myself. So I'm not sure how much all of you know about me. So some of you may not know much, apart from what Georgetown University wrote about me on their website, which can't be good, and it isn't.
Great. Not good, great.
No, it isn't. It isn't.
They don't
I know
need
that.
to, but it was good.
Yeah. It's really funny to read. So if you ever, bored, read the Georgetown website, and they think they know everything about me, and they have no clue. So anyway, when I sat down to write this book, first of all, it was important for me to go over the case. It's a 10-year case. There's a lot to discuss. Many court instances, I went all the way to the Supreme Court of Austria, and then finally, once I made it, or once the case was struck down at the Supreme Court, I then went to the European Court of Human Rights, which is a supranational court. But apart from that, I also needed to answer an important question, which is, again, why did I get into this? What prompted me to discuss Islam when there's so many other topics that I could discuss or find interest. And as I was looking back at my life, and mind you, this is not an autobiography, this is just an explanation of my different life stages from the very beginning to until now. I found out that basically the minute I was born, or actually when I came to the United States for the first time in 1975, it became very clear, my path became very clear. But of course I can only say that in hindsight. I'm almost 50 now, so now I can talk about it. But back then, if you look back, there was no other way for me to go than to fight for free speech, to fight for freedom, to fight for women's rights, but specifically for girls' rights, not to be married off, not to be destroyed, actually killed, mutilated. That was my path. That's where I needed to go. That's where I was going to go. So, how did I actually get into this? So I am the daughter of an Austrian diplomat. He's now retired. And I wasn't even born in Austria. I was born in Switzerland. And one of the first posts my dad was sent to was New York. And I attended kindergarten there. I learned the English language, spoke it perfectly. I even knew the Pledge of Allegiance by heart. And in 1977, so 2 years after my dad was consul, not consul general yet, we moved to Iran. And that was 1977.
Oh.
And you all know where I'm where I'm going with this. So I was in Iran at a very important stage. I was in Tehran, very important stage of my life, not only my life, but also historically, because Iran is when, in 1977, there were riots, there were demonstrations. The Shah was about to be overthrown. And there was the Ayatollah Khomeini, who was in Paris at the time, and who was sending by post his sermons from the mosques in Paris. And he was whipping up the faithful, the Muslim faithful in Iran. So I got to see a glimpse of Iranian life, Persian life, as a child. I attended school there. I went to first grade. And I also got to see, my father decided we needed to see something of the country, so we did some sightseeing. We went skiing. We drove to Basra in Iraq, southern Iraq, so all the way from the north to the south, and then up again to Baghdad, and then back to Tehran. I think it was the other way around. And I got a glimpse of this beautiful country, and as a child, it was peaceful, and then all of a sudden, overnight, to a young child, of course, it changed. and there were demonstrations in the streets, and there was Allahu Akbars during the nights, when people climbed onto their roofs and started screaming Allahu Akbar. This is what I remember. This is what I grew up with. I remember standing near the entrance of our house, and I was frightened. I didn't understand what it meant. I didn't understand what Magba Amerika meant. Death to America in Farsi. But I could hear the tone of the voices shouting all that, and all of a sudden the streets were filled with women who did not show their hair anymore, and it was all black. Everybody was black all of a sudden, and their fists, and their angry faces, and all of a sudden the country had changed. From a fairly free society, and I'm not saying the Shah was a saint, we all know that he wasn't, but from the fairly free society to all of a sudden no Coke, no Sprite, because it reminded people of
America.
No, of whiskey.
Oh.
And
Alcohol. Coke.
and the white was gin and vodka. So all of a sudden that was banned. So that's what I remember as a child. And all of a sudden apparently I couldn't go to school anymore because there were so many demonstrations. So I missed a lot of second grade. And also all of a sudden in late 1978, I described that in my book, all of a sudden my family was kicked out of Iran. We had to pack up quickly and had to leave the country. And my dad and my mom and my sister and I were separated for months and months and months. My dad had to remain at the Austrian embassy in Iran, but we were in Austria. There was no Skype, there was no phone service. It was maybe once a week that my parents could talk on the phone. My mother was constantly worried. The stress took a toll on her. It was tough, and that was my first introduction to something called Islam.
Only child?
As a child.
You're an only child?
No, I have a sister. So we left Iran in 1980. I won't go into more detail because I do want you to read it. Especially when our house was burned down and my mom and my sister and I were inside. How we survived that, and other tidbits of memories that I have of that time. So in 1980 we returned to Austria, went to ordinary primary school and grade school, but my dad was asked to fill in for the Austrian ambassador who was on an extended home leave in Baghdad. So my mother, my sister and I spent Christmas and New Year on the other side of the war, because in the meantime the Iran-Iraq war had broken out. So we moved to Baghdad for Christmas vacation. And there's actually a funny story in the book about how my mother had bought a Christmas tree that we took with us, and also lots of meat, frozen meat, and how our flight to Baghdad was held up with that frozen meat in Cyprus. And my mother was getting increasingly nervous about the meat thawing. And when we finally arrived in Baghdad, the airport was deserted. And as we picked up our bags, lots of them, because lots of food, it's a war economy, of course. You don't get everything you need, so you have to import it. So as we got our bags and we turned around, our trolleys, we left a trail of blood.
Ouch.
And thank God, of course, we left a trail of blood, and thank God there was no one at the airport. It was deserted at midnight, because that would have gotten us quite a few questions as to why we were leaving a trail of blood. So that's one of the stories in the book. The things that happen to you when you enter a country that is at war. So I was 11 years old, and I experienced, again, a country at war. Something that not many of my generation still remember what it's like. You know, it's not easy, and it gives me an appreciation for freedom and for a peaceful society, and which is why another reason why I'm fighting for peace and freedom, because I know what it's like when you have neither. So fast forward 1983, my dad was once again posted to the Austrian Consulate General in Chicago. So my sister and I had to relearn the language because we'd lost all of our English. We relearned the language in a matter of 2 months, entered school, and so 4 years of grade school and high school in Chicago for me. But an important step in my biography, or important part of my biography, is that back in 1985, I think, or 85, kids apparently in private school in Chicago were still forced to study the U.S. Constitution. And we had to pass an extremely difficult test in order to graduate from 8th grade. So we studied really hard. We were told that this was, a real tough one. And the first thing I thought was, why as an Austrian do I have to study the U.S. Constitution? Shouldn't I study my own Constitution first? Yeah? Of course I didn't have a choice. The second point I would like to make is, I was fascinated that I, as a 12-year-old, 13-year-old, I was able to understand the Constitution of a country. Compare that with the 2,500-page European Union Constitution, that even those who drafted it admit they have no clue what they drafted. And it was shoved down Europeans' throats, and as I write in the book, no wonder the Brits chose Brexit. That's exactly the reason. And you have such a simple and beautiful document with the First Amendment, and that has guided me ever since. That First Amendment, that First Amendment that gives me the right to express my feelings, to express my thoughts. And the First Amendment is, in my opinion, the gold standard of freedom of speech on this planet. And that's why I'm fighting hard to defend it. And I'm standing side by side with Americans to defend this First Amendment and the Bill of Rights in general. So, needless to say, I passed the test. I didn't do great, but I did pass it. I still have it in my possession. Very proud of it because this was the Reagan era, so all of the questions had in some way to do with Reagan and his administration, which was pretty exciting for me. And I am a child of the 80s, and I remember do you guys remember the Ollie North?
Iran Contra.
I was glued to the television. I'm such a news and politics junkie. It's not even funny anymore. I loved watching Ollie North defend himself. It was great.
Just because he was so gorgeous.
Yes. That was a man, huh? A man in his uniform. Well, probably that's the reason I married one. So, we left Chicago in 1987, which was just at the right time, because my sister and I were about to lose our German. So my parents asked to be transferred back home to Austria, where I graduated in 1989, and instead of going to college, I became a ski instructor. I did what Austrians do. I skied. So I became a ski instructor. And why do I tell you that? You're probably thinking, well, why is she telling me that? That's not important. Yes, it is, because in summer you can't ski. Well, on a glacier, but usually you don't ski. So I was looking for a summer job, and my dad told me, oh, my friend, the ambassador in Kuwait, needs someone in the visa section. That was August of 1990. Do you know what happened in August of 1990?
You had to go for it.
Well, it was
the first.
It was just the invasion.
Yeah, the invasion.
But as my friend Karen Siegemund, who wrote the introduction to this book, wrote, I have a way of being a bit Forrest Gumpian. So, wherever I go, something happens.
Action, yeah.
And that's what happened. I was stuck in Kuwait, and I won't tell you about that harrowing trip across the desert because that has its own chapter in the book. Just suffice it to say, it was a very, very harrowing journey from Kuwait all the way to the Iraqi-Turkish border via Baghdad. And if you know your geography, you know how far it is. And it was August, the hottest month of the year in the Middle East. And we were in a convoy of quite a few cars. And if you don't know whether or not the Americans are going to attack, of course, in 2020 hindsight, it's easy. Well, it wasn't a big deal. They didn't attack you anyway. Well, you didn't know that at the time. And where do you hide in a flat desert? You don't. We were sitting ducks in a desert. So that alone was frightening, but probably the worst part of it was the selection process of those who were allowed to leave Iraq and cross the border into Turkey. That was probably the worst part of it all because it was basically you stay, you go. You stay, you go. And I didn't go. So I was left behind. And remember that I was 19 years old at the time. So that part, the selection process, that was very difficult to deal with. And I suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, which back in the early 1990s was not yet being treated. So I had to get over it myself. And how did I do that? Once we returned back to Austria, I went back to my mountains and I went back to skiing. After the 4th season of skiing, my dad said, okay, that's it. I'm not paying for you anymore. You got to get a real job. So that's what I did. I did not yet have a college degree. So I was just a small secretary for an American mergers and acquisitions banker. And it took me about 14 months to realize that the dairy business opportunities in Bulgaria were not exactly what I had envisioned for my life. I was bored stiff. I cannot even begin to explain to you how boring the dairy business in Bulgaria was, even though, it had just become free from communism, it had been liberated, and there were, I just couldn't appreciate it. This guy was so excited about the dairy business. I was like, I don't care. You do that. I left. I continued. I went on and got another job, and this time I went back into politics. I became assistant to the European Affairs coordinator for the Austrian Vice Chancellor, who was at the time due to be relieved of his job, which was good because I couldn't stand the guy anyway. But the new guy I really did like. His name was Wolfgang Schüssel. And at the time I really admired him, and I'm I can be a cheeky person.
Really?
Yes, slightly, yes. And I was lucky because I ran into him, and he knew my father vaguely, and he said, oh, yeah, right, I know you. How are you? I'm like, well, I'm okay. I just don't know if I'm going to have a job after you take office. He's like, well, why? I said, well, if you want me to stay, I'll stay. And I guess he liked that, and within a few days I had my job as his personal assistant, and that gave me the opportunity to learn Austrian politics, how, all the legislative process. It was fascinating. For me as a political animal, it was just fascinating. I met all these great people because the Austrian Vice Chancellor was also Minister of Foreign Affairs. So, fast forward, in 1997 I decided to return to Kuwait. I needed to finish some stuff in Kuwait. I had promised that I would return on my own terms and I would leave Kuwait on my own terms. Not because Saddam Hussein says you have to leave, but because I want to leave. So I once again packed my bags, this time in earnest, got my cat, and said goodbye to my parents. My father had since become ambassador to Greece, and stood at the airport in Athens and packed my stuff and left. I was getting kind of, I was excited to return. It was easy to return, but the big difference was that for the first time I lived Islam for 4 years. You know, the first Ramadan is exciting. You're like, oh, this is so different. All the lights and you know, people don't eat and drink from sunrise to sunset. It was exotic. It was different. Okay, and back in 1997, Ramadan also coincided with Christmas. So we had the same days off, Muslims and non-Muslims, and basically, again, it was exotic. It was exciting. By the second Ramadan, you're like, oh God, not again. You know, just leave me alone. I can't be bothered. I'm not Muslim. I don't care about that. But when you live in an Islamic country, Islam doesn't ignore you, and you can't ignore Islam. And that's the important message I have. You cannot escape it, because it will come and look for you. You always have to take care. Can I go out now, or do I have a bottle of water in my hand? Can I go out now? No, I can't. You have to hide the bottle of water. You have your friend sitting next to you in your car, and back then smoking in your car wasn't really a problem. You have to remove the cigarette because it's Ramadan. You can't do that. You have to watch out. Ramadan working hours are much different. People sleep mostly, for the most part, during the day. And it's really loud at night because everything, of course, shifts to nighttime. So it's just completely different, and it's alien, and it gets on your nerves. At least it did for me back then. Oops, I'm sorry.
Did you wear a hijab?
No, I did not. No. Kuwait was fairly, I mean, no, you could, and I'm sure it has changed ever since. But back then it was fairly free. I could even wear a short skirt when I still had, back then I still had the legs to wear short skirts, which I no longer do. And I was much younger, and of course when you're 25 or something, you wear short skirts. How do you get, life is just, you always have to make such plans to get around. Of course, once in a while you like to have a beer. Well, you can't go and buy a beer because the country is dry. But from the embassy, we're allowed to order alcohol. We had a certain list, and we were allowed to order a certain amount of alcohol. But we did that through another embassy because it was a big shipment that came from the United Arab Emirates. Well, you can't just drive and pick up booze. So you have to hide it. And then when you drive back with your car full of booze, you have to really make sure that you don't get into an accident. Because can you imagine how embarrassing? Somebody crashes into your car and all those bottles all of a sudden, never mind if you get hurt, but all those bottles, how are you going to explain those bottles to police? So, it sounds funny maybe, but it really makes life a challenge. Once in a while you feel like having a salami. Of course you have to think about that when you're in Austria, because you have to import the salami. Just because you get the taste of it doesn't mean that Kuwaiti food is bad. It's not. But it's just, once in a while you feel like having some. Well, in the States, you go to the next, or here probably, you can get your salami, right? Well, you couldn't do that in Kuwait. What annoyed me also, it was pre-Amazon days. I couldn't read the books I wanted to read. Why? Because they were all censored. And that annoyed me because I don't want somebody telling me, well, you can't read that. Because usually what I do is when somebody tells me, you can't do that, I'll do it. because I don't like being told what to read or what to eat or what not to eat. I make my decision. I'm old enough. I was raised to be a responsible adult, so why should somebody tell me? I'm sick and tired of people telling me, especially religious people. So no Amazon. Amazon just got started when I was in Kuwait, and visiting bookstores in Kuwait was useless because it was old books and books that had made it through censorship. Just the word censorship drove me nuts. So I won't go into more detail about Kuwait because, again, you will read about it in the book. There's lots of funny and not so funny stories, like the one time I was smacked by an Egyptian friend for telling him that I think Islam was not exactly the best idea that had happened to this world. And I'm putting this very mildly because I know we're on camera. So all of a sudden I was, smacked. This guy wanted to convert me to Islam. It didn't really work out. So, so that was that. I learned dawah, or the invitation to Islam, the hard way. Yes, and of course in Kuwait I met my husband. And no, he's not Kuwaiti, he's Austrian. I met him there. We got married pretty fast. And as he was still in medical school and I was due to leave Kuwait, I decided I had not yet had enough of Islam. I don't know what made me think that. But I did have a choice between Albania and Libya. So I went to Libya. I did not go to Albania. I decided on Libya, which in hindsight was probably a big mistake because Libya is the worst country ever. And I've seen quite a few, but Libya is a nightmare. And it was already, well, it's a nightmare now, but it was already a nightmare under Gaddafi because it's pure socialism combined with Islam. I mean, two of the worst isms on this planet combined in a country that is actually breathtakingly beautiful. I mean, those beaches there, unbelievable. But of course, what can you do? There's no toilets, there's no infrastructure, you have just the wild beaches. So the problem in Libya was basically that you had to be a very strong character. There was nothing to do. No beach club, no shopping, no grocery stores. The milk I bought came from a sort of a cooperative, and you picked it up, and it was not pasteurized, so it was spoiled after 2 days. And it was packaged just in a plastic bag. So when I got back home, I had to I had to pour this into an old water bottle. I had imported, and you will see a photo of this in the book, about, I think it was 300 or 400 bottles of water. Toilet paper, no toilet paper available. And if available, extremely expensive. So I had literally, a ton of toilet paper.
It was socialistic, Islamic, and primitive.
Yep, exactly.
But how was the skiing?
Not really. I didn't really need it because, the great thing was that, and that's why I also chose it, it was only an hour and a half away from Vienna, where my husband was studying at medical school. So he would visit me frequently, but at the same time he was still studying at medical school. So after a year of socialistic Islam, or Islamic socialism, it doesn't matter how you want to call it, I called it quits, and I was repatriated to Austria, thank God. But I was in Libya on September 11th, 2001. Of all places, right? Telling you, right? But that was finally the end. I mean, that was the end of my Forrest Gumpian life. I was in Libya, and my Libyan I was due to leave that night to go to just for a few days of R&R to Austria. And I remember specifically that my Libyan landlord barged into my apartment, started screaming. He didn't even bother knocking on the door. Started screaming, "The Jews did it! I know it! The Jews were behind all this." And it was very hard for me. I couldn't just kick him out, which I first wanted to kick him somewhere else, and then kick him out. I just said, I am pretty certain that the Jews were not behind this, and I'm going to ask you to leave right now. But it was hard, this was my landlord. He lived above me. I couldn't just use choice words because I still had to deal with this man, and I was sort of at his mercy. There was, some way I had to deal with him. He always thought I was not normal for living alone and my husband not being with me. But that basically I proved his point by not agreeing with him that the Jews were behind 9/11. So finally, I left all this behind me, went back to school in Austria, got my degree, and then had my beautiful daughter. And during this time, when I was busy raising my child, I noticed that Austria had changed dramatically. Back then, I was still using public transportation, which I have since stopped doing. And I saw a change in the makeup of society. I saw a lot of headscarves, because that's, of course, how Islam manifests itself at first glance, of course. Why was that? Because of, the Bosnian War. Austria took in a very high number of Bosnian Muslim refugees in the 1990s, and of course they became visible. They started teaming up with those Muslims who were already in the country, and the numbers just exploded. And of course these numbers were present in the streets, and that's how I saw, after my return from overseas, I saw how this had changed, and it worried me. But I still, and that's important, had not read the Quran by this time, and we're talking 2005, 2006. I had not read the Hadith, the sayings and traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, and I had not read the Sirah, the biography of Muhammad, which is very good, because otherwise I would have been kicked out of Kuwait and Libya. So it was very good that I had no clue about Islamic theology by that point. So at some point there was some sort of divine intervention, and I got hold of a book that I started reading about Islam, and in its own from its own sources. So no Western imperialistic sources, but Islamic sources, explaining everything about Islam, and it opened my eyes wide. I mean, I had taken the red pill, and I was frightened, very, very frightened, because I saw this tsunami wall of water in front of me, and I didn't know how to escape it. I mean, this was massive. How can you stop this? It's right there. It's dangerous. It's going to eat us up, and it's going to change us, and it might even kill us. Well, ever since then, I've always said, look, fear can't paralyze you. What you need to do is you need to study. You need to educate yourself about this problem, because only then will you be able to take action and take the right action. There's no real point in starting to attack people verbally. I've always been of that belief. I still believe that firmly. There's no point in attacking people verbally. I then hooked up with people from America, got onto the blog radio business sort of circuit. I started reporting about what was going on in Europe. And all of a sudden, all doors were open, and I was invited to a counter-jihad conference in Brussels, where I finally met all the people that I needed to meet to connect. And when you're not, when you're in a group like we are right now, you don't feel alone anymore. You can at least talk about it, because if you're on your own, you get all kinds of crazy ideas. So you need to really vent, you need to talk about it, you need to discuss it. So that's what I did. simultaneously in 2008, and now we're finally getting to the gist of the story. In 2008, I was commissioned by the Austrian Freedom Party to hold seminars on Islam and its effect on European society. So what I did is 12 hours worth of fully sourced PowerPoint presentations that started at first with an attendance of maybe 4 or 5 people and quickly grew more popular. And in 2009, I already had 30 people listening to me. It may not sound like a lot, but it was. I mean, exponentially, if you look from 40 to 30, from 4 to 30, that's quite something. Again, fully sourced PowerPoint presentations. That's an important point. So, because this became more and more popular, these seminars, and because they were organized by a right-wing extremist party, one day a young journalist infiltrated the seminar and the seminars and secretly recorded the seminars, and the transcript were then sent to the public prosecutor, who in turn gleefully, I suppose, pressed charges for incitement to hatred or hate speech. That was 2009.
But this was in a private place that you were doing?
It was a private setting, yes, yes.
So he's allowed to, you're not allowed to say whatever you want in a private setting?
Well, it was debated whether or not it was a private setting, because invitations were sent out to the public to be able to attend this, but you couldn't attend unless you registered. So now the question becomes, was it public or was it not public? The public prosecutor decided it was public. So I went through the trial, the details of which you will find in the book. So in the first instance, the lower court, it was a woman judge, and I knew right away, you know, once I see a woman judge, that's not going to work out. And it didn't, unfortunately. So among other, I mean, you have to imagine 12 hours of transcripts. I mean, a lot of stuff. I said a lot of stuff. What got me in the end was, it was very clear there was no incitement to hatred, because the tapes, some of the tapes were played, and immediately it was clear there was no incitement. But then the judge, at her own discretion, added another charge and said, well, I have to inform you that I'm changing the charge now to denigration of religious teachings. Blasphemy.
There's such a church?
Yes.
In Austrian law?
Yes. Denigration of religious teachings of a legally recognized religion.
So just official religions that are...
Exactly. Yes. So Islam is one of the official religions in Austria. Legally recognized. It's not an official religion as in, well, it's state recognized.
That's from the Austro-Hungarian Empire,
Yes.
right? That's a holdover from a 1900 or...
Well, it actually goes back to Joseph II. Goes back all the way, Toleranzpatent. I don't know what you would call this in English. Joseph II, Toleranzpatent.
The like Declaration of Tolerance or something?
Patent of tolerance.
Yeah, it's when the Jews were first officially recognized as being part of the Austrian Empire. But you will find all of that in the book. It's in the appendix. You will have the analyses of why this situation is so special in Austria. No other country in this world has a so-called law on Islam that we do in Austria. So you'll find it in there. I don't want to get into this now. It's too complicated, and it will take too much time. So anyway, denigration of religious teachings. Of course, I was found guilty. I mean, that was clear from the minute she said, "I have to inform you that." And listen to the reasoning she gave. 2 reasonings. First, oh no, I have to explain to you what I said. I'm sorry. Okay. What she didn't like was, and I said, you know, I talked for 12 hours, I said a lot of things, but the one thing in particular she didn't like was, I asked a rhetorical question when I talked about Muhammad and his marriage to a 6-year-old and the consummation of this marriage when she was 9, Aisha when she was 9. And cognizant of the fact that in Austria it's not allowed to say Muhammad is a pedophile, which I wouldn't have said anyway. I said,
Why not?
what do you call this if not pedophilia? Give me another word. Okay? If I'm not allowed to say this behavior is pedophilia, but well, then what is it? Do we call it X? Do we call it Y? Do we call it nothing? What do we call it? And that's what she found me guilty on denigration of religious teachings because I said that. And her reasoning was A, during the Habsburg empires or during the European Middle Ages, it was very common for children to get married. Well, duh. But those were children and children marriages. This was not a 56-year-old geezer, I'm sorry, and a 6-year-old girl, a child, who, according to Islamic traditions, when she was married off, she was playing with a doll. Correct me if I'm wrong. It says in the hadith,
Yeah.
I was playing with a doll when I was called to
When
the
her
room.
father sold her to.
Her mother
Exactly.
called her and brushed her hair and took
See?
her in to
That
see
was for the
Mohammed.
consummation she was playing with.
Yeah,
the
well,
dolls.
it's despicable, it's disgusting, and, you know. So, that was the first explanation why it just can't be pedophilia, because child marriages, okay? But the second reason is even more ludicrous. She said, well, because Aisha stayed with Muhammad until he died, i.e. until she was 18 when he died, it couldn't have been pedophilia.
Oh, please.
Not kidding.
Yes, right. Okay. So that was the reasoning. I was ordered to pay 480 euros, which doesn't sound a lot on the face of it, but it was a lot because it was 1/3 of the maximum sentence, and the sentences are calculated in so-called day fines. And because I was out of a job and will be for the rest of my life, I was, ordered to pay 120 day fines of 4 euros each, i.e. 480 euros, which is a lot of money, because if you're in a job and they sentence you to 120 day fines at 100 euros each, you do the math. So it's a lot of money. So, of course, we appealed right away. It took a year for the appeal to be heard. The second, these reasonings, every court instance and every judge, their explanation of what I said was wrong became crazier and crazier. So the appeals court said, well, we don't dispute that Muhammad got married when Aisha was 6 years old and consummated the marriage when she was 9, but calling it pedophilia is an excess of opinion, so you can't say it.
But you didn't. But you didn't say it.
Well, even
Well,
if she
I know
did,
that.
You rhetorically
Yeah, but,
implied it, yeah, but
couldn't you?
Yeah, well, I know I couldn't. There was nothing to do. We appealed. Yeah, it's over. There's nothing we can do.
It's not even the phone and whatever. It's just the frustration that you can't.
Yes,
Say
exactly, exactly. I feel your frustration. I'm also still frustrated. When I wrote this book, believe me, I was frustrated all over again.